wanted to start off by asking many Americans learned that slavery was a tragic contradiction to American freedom. Your work argues to the contrary, that it was an intentional foundation of the Americans' following, of the nation's following, excuse me. Why does this distinction matter today?
Well, it matters today, not least because it sheds light upon the terrible life conditions that now afflict many Black people in the United States of America. I just finished doing or broadcasting an interview on KPFK Los Angeles, the Pacifica station of Los Angeles, with Joseph Graves, who is the McKinley Scott Endowed Professor of Biology at North Carolina A&T, Jesse Jackson's alma mater. And his book is on why Black people's health outcomes are so horrible in this country, with regard to infant mortality rates, with regard to hypertension, with regard to death and childbirth, for example. And by the way, it's not just a class phenomenon because we know that the billionaire, Beyonce Knowles, almost suffered a death in childbirth when she was giving birth, not to mention the multimillionaire Serena Williams. And Professor Graves, like many before him, have ascribed these terrible health outcomes to structural racism, with structural racism being a component element of the United States of America since its inception. That is to say, as I've said in a number of books, and others have done the same, on the eve of the US Civil War, the most valuable investment and asset in the United States of America, as then existed, was the investment in the bodies of enslaved Africans, for example, more valuable than the railways, for example. And so if you think that the revolt against British rule in 1776 was designed to install freedom and liberty for all, uh, it does not explain, for example, why, by several orders of magnitude, Black people did not join George Washington and the slave owners, unlike settler colonialism, the system under which we still labor, which involves class collaboration between and amongst those of European descent from the 1% to the 99%. How else can you explain how Donald J. Trump got 77 million votes in November 2024, his second election after trying to overthrow the 2020 election on January 6, 2021? And I think, sadly, many of our friends on the left are infected with what I call left-wing white nationalism. Uh, that is to say, they think that just because the settler regime welcomed those who were persecuted in Europe, that provided a template for how they were going to treat the indigenous population, the population of African descent. As I pointed out in my book on Southern Africa, when apartheid was installed at the southern tip of Africa in 1948, per consultations with the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the intention was to provide benefits to the poor of European descent so that they would not ally with the African majority. And to a certain extent, that worked, unquote. But if you look at the illogic of many of our friends on this side of the Atlantic, uh, they, I guess, would have counseled Nelson Mandela to let history uh, work as magic. And because assets and benefits were extended to the European minority, poor and working class, that was a template for how the Africans would be treated. But instead, these benefits and assets, or what I call combat pay, was extended to these European migrants, and also, to be fair, European adjacent migrants, that is to say, Christians from Lebanon, even from Egypt, for example, who have been integrated into the so-called white population, unquote, that this was a way to recruit a militia per the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution to repress the indigenous population and to corral and subject the proliferating and growing population of African descent, which had allies, not least across the border in Canada, and not to mention across the Atlantic with regard to the growing abolitionist movement. And I think the question today for many of our friends on the left is, since so many seem to think quite correctly that we're in the foothills of fascism, it's incumbent to explain and explicate where this project went wrong. That is to say, if this was such a great leap forward for humanity, how did we wind up in the foothills of fascism, for example? I mean, was it during the Andrew Jackson period? They have no answer. They don't even ask the question, not to mention not having an answer. And so I'm happy to say on the other side of the equation that, as they say in the United States, perhaps outside the United States, there's nothing like the prospect of execution in the morning for concentrating the mind. And I'm beginning to think that there's nothing like the prospect of fascism on our doorstep for concentrating the mind and making people think more carefully and critically about how we got to this point. Because if we don't have an explanation of how we got to this point, it might be difficult to come up with a remedy as to how we dig ourselves out of this deep hole in which we find ourselves. That's the import of having an adequate and accurate analysis of the founding, because I try to keep up with what our friends on the left are coming up with. And of course, they'll say, oh, if only the Democratic Party would say they were for socialism, for example, then these Euro-American workers and poor would not vote Republican. Okay, so like many anti-scientific elements, they oftentimes ignore contrary evidence. So you just had an election in New York City, for example, with a social democrat, Mamdani, prevailing. Now, you would think that our friends on the left would look at that electoral result, do an analysis, and perhaps ask, why is it that Mamdani's totals proportionately were less on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where the 1% reside, and in Staten Island, where the Italian American, Irish American, Jewish American working class reside? I haven't seen any analysis on that basis, for example. And, as you can see, I get very frustrated talking about this question.
The concrete wears the stories of the feet that never rested. A social contract broken and a justice system tested. We're tracing lines in the dust where the giants used to stand, building up a blueprint for a long-awaited land. It's a rhythm in the marrow, it's a whisper in the wind, knowing where the struggle stops and where the truths begin. So let the awareness rise like the tide against the shore. We aren't asking for a fragment, we are asking for the more. In the cadence of the collective, in the soul of the beat, we find the courage to stand up, even when we feel the heat, even when we feel the heat. The metaphor of shadows is the comfort of the blind, but we're breaking through the static of a cultivated mind. Every voice is a brushstroke on a canvas, painted colors of a different kind of day. Urgency is not a fire, it's a slow and steady flame, keeping us from forgetting why we ever started the game. So let the awareness rise like the tide against the shore. We aren't asking for a fragment, we are asking for the more. In the cadence of the collective, in the soul of the beat, we find the courage to stand up, even when we feel the heat, even when we feel the heat. Metaphor in motion, urgency in the air. Are you listening? Are you there? The rhythm remains, the reflection continues. Stay aware. Peace.